2 weeks ago, I made a video that is currently very well received, and that was the top 5 Yu-Gi-Oh cards that dominated middle school. And a lot of those dominated middle school because we didn't know what the rules were. And today, I wanted to do a different one, and that's pretty simple. It's just an upgrade in terms of years. So these are the top 5 cards that dominated high school. Now, I want to preface this because there's going to be a couple differences between this list and the last one. And I also want to mention that everyone in high school has different experiences with Yu-Gi-Oh! So the main differences with these cards is that in high school, I would assume that most of us actually know the majority of the mechanics in the game. We might not know all of the intricate card rulings, but as far as actually reading the cards, we usually should be able to do that, unlike in middle school or in elementary school, where a lot of the time you're just making up the effect based on the artwork or what you saw on the TV show. Now, I also want to say, and this is really, really, really important, and it's worth the 3 reallys, everyone in high school has a different experience with Yu-Gi-Oh! And what I mean by that is basically 2 different camps, because in high school, a lot of people are just casuals, which is basically what this video is going to focus on. But a lot of other people, including myself in high school, that was the time that we actually started playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Competitively. If you were one of those people, like myself, these cards probably didn't apply to you. However, in my high school, there were a lot of people that played sort of casually, and even though my deck was better than theirs and I took the game more seriously than them, these were the cards that I noticed were very successful in that metagame, and when I played with them and I used a worse deck, these were the cards that I sort of latched onto because they were not overpowered, but definitely were good in that high school metagame. Now, in high school, a lot of people, even if they don't have competitive decks, they have decks that at least have some sort of strategy, as opposed to middle school where the decks were sort of just thrown together with whatever you had. This means that the decks are going to be a little more effective. They probably have a lot more removal than the previous years that you played Yu-Gi-Oh!, which makes cards that were in the last video not as effective in this format because removal is so prevalent. So all those things in mind, let's jump into the top 5 cards that dominated high school. Number 1 is Wave Motion Cannon. Now, this card is sort of like the biggest bait, I feel like. It's a 1 card, 8,000 damage if you can hold it on the field for 8 turns. And even though there is removal in high school formats, I would say that it's still not on par with the level of removal that you see in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, even competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Back then, at least. I was in high school 5 years ago. And even though a lot of people had like Mystical Space Typhoon, maybe Heavy Storm, they weren't always going to draw those. Not everyone even played 40 cards in their deck list. A lot of times they played 50 or 60, which made it a lot harder to draw those cards. And the real crucial part about Wave Motion Cannon is that you don't actually have to wait the full 8 turns. Now, when a lot of people first see this card, at least when I saw this card, I was like, man, a 1 card, 8,000 damage, that's broken. But actually, the really good part about Wave Motion Cannon is that you can keep it on the board for, let's say, 4, maybe 5 turns if you want to be greedy, and your opponent is holding on to that MST until you get it to 7 turns or 8 turns to destroy it, but then you just send it to the graveyard and do 4,000 damage, and they've now wasted all that time when they could have just destroyed this, because they want to get the most value out of their spell and trap card removal, so they're going to hold it until you're like threatening lethal damage. So if you send it to the graveyard just a couple turns early, you can get a huge swing in tempo, and it can really turn the duel around. So Wave Motion Cannon definitely made a big impact on my high school metagame. The next card, one of my all-time favorite cards, and that is The Creator. Now, looking back on this card wasn't that powerful, so it can't be special summon from the graveyard, which is sort of frustrating, especially because everyone had Premature Burial, Monster Reborn, and all those cards. But I'm assuming that's because they didn't want you special summoning it with its own effect, which is you can send 1 monster from your hand to the graveyard, you can select a monster in your graveyard, discard a card, and then special the monster from the grave. So it's essentially a card that when you get it on the field, turns any card in your hand into a monster reborn. Now, the really cool thing about Creator, and the main way that people use this card, is that you could use the Creator Incarnate, which was a level 4 monster, and it was a warrior as well, so you could search it with reinforcements of the army. You can just tribute Creator Incarnate to special summon this guy from your hand. And while that play, in retrospect, is not that good because it's just a straight -1 to summon a big body, basically, in a vacuum, as far as early formats of Yu-Gi-Oh!, that actually was pretty darn good. This guy had a lot of attack, a lot of defense, and it kept reviving your monsters. So pretty much a solid card all around. And it was pretty easy to come by as well. It came in a structure deck, obviously had multiple printings before that as well. So a lot of people had access to the card, a lot of people played this card, and while it might have not been the game ender that a lot of us thought it was, I can still say that it dominated most people's decks, and a lot of people ended up playing the Creator no matter what strategy they were actually using. Now, the next one is one that a lot of people commented that was really hard to deal with in middle school, and I think it applies to high school as well, and that is Ordeal of a Traveler. This card is super annoying if you don't actually have a way to get rid of it. At the time, I basically thought this was a way to infinitely negate attacks with little to no drawback. Now, I realize that it doesn't really accomplish anything, and it gives your opponent free information. However, back in the high school formats and in the middle school formats, you pretty much knew all the cards in your opponent's deck. If you were playing them at recess or lunch break every single day, you probably knew every card in their deck, so the free information didn't help that much. But Ordeal of the Traveler, essentially, if you don't get lucky, you can just never attack, pretty much. And that's really rough. And if you don't draw the MST, or if you don't feel like this is worth the MST, I mean, say your opponent has Ordeal of a Traveler and Wave Motion Cannon, which one do you destroy? That kind of leaves your opponent in a rough spot. Not everyone has Heavy Storm, not everyone Harpy's Feather Duster. Ordeal of the Traveler was definitely the cause of a lot of frustration for people in high school. A lot of people had access to it. I think that's like one of the key things in the high school decks, is that cards like this that were reprinted a whole bunch of times were really easy to come by, especially for newer players. And in that regard, this card was one of the most annoying. I can remember just trying to attack into this over and over and over again. If your opponent had like 1 or 2 cards in your hand, you could maybe get it right after a couple guesses. But if your opponent had 5 full cards in hand, and the decks back then were pretty balanced, they had mostly monster spells and traps all evenly distributed. That's just how we built decks back then. This card was nearly impossible to deal with, and you were stuck just randomly guessing every time. And that can be really frustrating, especially when a lot of the cards back then required a couple turns of setup to get like a tribute out. This card could prevent you from actually running over their tribute material before they got a chance to tribute summon. Number 2 is another card that was commented a lot on the middle school deck profile, or the middle school top 5 list, but I think that it's a lot more effective in high school, and that is Elemental Hero Wildheart. So Elemental Hero Wildheart has a really simple line of text, and it's just that this card is unaffected by the effects of trap cards. Now this sort of draws back on that thing that I was saying when we first started the video, and that's that in high school, our decks were a lot more refined, and they usually had a lot more removal. One of the most popular pieces of removal was Sakuratsu Armor, but a lot of people also had Mirror Force, and in that way, Elemental Hero Wildheart dodged both those cards. If you don't own Dark Hole or Regeki, you relied on cards like Sakuratsu Armor to actually deal with your opponent's monsters, and Wildheart could not be dealt with that way. It also had a respectable amount of attack and defense for its time period, and it was searchable by a whole bunch of different things. I'm thinking Reinforcements of the Army, Elemental Hero Stratos, and Emergency Call, all cards that were pretty easy to come by, which I know I keep reiterating, but it is pretty important that the cards are easy to come by, and you could search Wildheart with all of those cards, and then you wouldn't even have to play a full Elemental Hero deck to make use of this card, because it had solid stats and typing and a pretty good attribute as well. So a lot of people played Wildheart. It was a common when it first came out, and you could just, I mean, if your opponent had a bunch of back row but not a lot of monsters, you could summon Wildheart and be sure, or you could be sure that nothing would happen to it, basically, until your opponent actually summoned a monster bigger than it, which means you could get in some cheap damage, and in 1500, after a couple turns, really adds up. Coming in at number 1 is another card that I probably could have put on the middle school list, but that is Solar Flare Dragon. The sole reason that this card did not make on the middle school list is because I believe that in middle school, not everyone has the opportunity to get multiple copies, let alone play sets of cards. And Solar Flare Dragon, in this list, the reason that it's at number 1 is because this card is ridiculously overpowered when you have multiple copies on the board and your opponent doesn't have a way to deal with it. 500 damage every single turn, and if you have 2, that's 1,000. If you have 3, that's 1,500. You don't have to attack, but you also can attack, which is sort of like the crazy part here, is that one Solar Flare Dragon is doing 2,000 damage every turn. If your opponent has an open board, you could just summon one of these. If your opponent didn't out it, you could summon a second one. Now you have a lock that's doing 1,000 damage every turn, plus the damage from them attacking. Just super annoying to deal with. And this card, a lot of people played it at 2 or 3. It was pretty much only effective at 2 or 3. By itself, it doesn't really do anything. Pyro decks in general were not even half bad back then. The Fire Structure deck that came out gave players a lot of good cards to use, like Solar Flare Dragon. Ultimate Baseball Kit, I believe, is in that as well. Just fire monsters in general. Raging Flame Sprite was good too. But Solar Flare Dragon was probably the most annoying of those cards, just because it was so darn difficult to deal with. I remember raging really hard at this card for a while. Depending on if you had Dark Hole or not, this card could be impossible to deal with, especially if your opponent chose to not attack with it, which meant that you couldn't Sakaratsu Armor or Mirror Force it. There were just a lot of times in high school and in middle school where my opponent would summon 2 copies of this, and I would actually just have to scoop because I had no way to kill it. But anyway, that was my top 5 list of the top 5 Yu-Gi-Oh cards that dominated high school. Hopefully you guys agree with this list. If you didn't, or if you have any other new ones to add to it, please feel free to put it in the comments. I had a lot of fun reading the middle school comments and seeing what dominated your guys' metagames, because obviously every school is going to be a little different. Everyone is in school at different times and has access to different cards. But anyway, I will see you guys later. Bye.